Hello and welcome to this video, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the mysterious origins of jazz and possibly the mysterious origins of the blues. Of course, jazz and the blues are two forms of music which, although different, really hold hands with each other stylistically, So as John McLaughlin once said, if you take the blues out of jazz, you've got no jazz, and if you take the jazz out of blues, you've got no blues. Now, why is the origins of jazz so mysterious? Well, it's a strange thing, this, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to put this video together. On this channel I've been exploring a lot of jazz fusion, a lot of progressive rock. I've been discussing all sorts of different things around those, and some of you may have noticed I've taken a little break to have a rethink of what I wanted to do next with this channel. And what I think I'd like to do is actually go deeper into the history of jazz and not just do a straight interpretation of jazz history, but actually get into some nooks and crannies and discuss things which I think don't necessarily get mentioned when people talk about the history of jazz. If you want to really understand the history of jazz, I would say go and watch the jazz documentary by Ken Burns. That's a great visual documentation, but there are problems with the Ken Burns documentary, and we can explore those in these videos. I grew up with a book called Jazz by Joachim Berendet. I hope I've said that right. I tried to find my copy in here, but of course, if you know what my studio's like, it's somewhere, but I can't find it. But that's also gives you a really different view of jazz history. I've read loads and loads of books on jazz history. I've listened to loads of records. I've watched loads of stuff on YouTube. And there's things I've noticed about it that people don't mention, or I think they get wrong perhaps. But of course, all this is my subjective interpretation. But here we are anyway, part one, where we're going to have a look at the origins of jazz. And I'm going to get into some of those sort of areas which I think haven't been explored. So why do I think it's mysterious? Well, for me, let's start with the basic premises of what jazz is. Jazz is a style of music that emerges at the beginning of the 20th century. So styles of music, new styles of music must pioneer new ideas, right? So if you imagine classical music and folk music, these two things that existed already, what does jazz do that's not classical music and not folk music? Well, the first thing is, we must remember, it does do certain things that are in classical music. So, for example, the harmonic theory that underlies jazz is actually is classical music theory. And a lot of the technique used to play the instrument, and a lot of the instruments like clarinets and, double basses, things like that, pianos, they've come from the classical music world. So there's similarities there, and those have to be considered. But what are the things that jazz do that's new when it emerges? Well, one of the things it does is it uses improvisation. Now, of course, musicians have always improvised. Improvising on an instrument is the most natural thing to do. And of course, we know that people like Mozart and Beethoven were fantastic improvisers, and they would have improvisation built into their classical music pieces. But what classical musicians tend to do is that they would improvise on a theme, on the melody, and they would improvise alone. They would extemporize. So we'd take that melody and they would extend it with improvisation. Now, what jazz musicians do, the thing that they invented, which is fantastic, is that they created a form of music where everyone can improvise, and they could all improvise at the same time under sets of rules. And there's different sets of rules to how you improvise that's come from jazz. So it's the group improvisation and the organisation of improvisation into compositions, so that the improvisation becomes an inherent part of the composition. I would say that is one of the things that jazz has pioneered that didn't exist before. Now, why did it happen? It happened because of recording. You could be doing this for as much as you like and for as long as you like, but until you can record it, what recording does is it then locks that improvisation into a structure. So, if we listen to Giant Steps Now by John Coltrane, you can go on YouTube and see analyses of exactly what Coltrane played, and it's all written out. People treat it like a score. That's improvisation, but they treat it like a compositional statement. Well, you can't have that until recording is invented. And this is one of the key things that I think doesn't get mentioned with the history of jazz, is how interrelated it is to the invention of recording. All right, so that's the first thing. We've got improvisation and all the things that come from that. The other thing is an individual voice, a sound. You know, if we think of Louis Armstrong singing alongside Ella Fitzgerald, they both have completely different voices. You know, Lester Young sounds completely different to Coleman Hawkins. This really differs from the classical tradition. Yes, amongst soloists there are slight differences, but nowhere near the differences you get within jazz, right? And nowhere near the differences you get with popular music. And this is something I really want to discuss, is how jazz and blues is really the mother and father of all popular music, of all commercial music in the 21st century. I actually see those forms of existing within the style of jazz. I don't see jazz as being separate to popular music. I see popular music as something that has grown out of jazz. And this is really related to the individual voice. One of the things that happened in the 21st century is popular music made lots of money because people were buying records. Here we go again. Recordings are so important here. And when you buy a recording, you want to be able to recognize the person on that recording. And if you buy a Madonna album, you want to hear a voice. You don't want to hear a sort of classical voice that sounds like everybody else or similar. You want to hear a completely individualistic voice. If you're buying a Brian Ferry album or a Meatloaf album or a Bob Dylan album or a Tina Turner album, that album is defined by the individual voice of that person. And jazz really shows you how to create compositions that accommodate for that, to accommodate for an individual voice. This is a massively important thing, as important as improvisation. And of course, improvisation is wound into that as well. Because if we listen to a modern popular singer singing a song, we don't expect them to sing it note for note like a classical musician. We expect them to sing it in their own way, put their own little bits and bobs on that to improvise. Right? So what does a classical musician actually do? Well, a classical musician is interpreting what the composer wants, right? And the composer, to do that, has to be able to predict, you know, quite accurately what the instrument they're writing for is going to sound like. If they're writing for the violin needs to sound like the violin sound in its head. It can't sound like Stefan Grappelli or John-Luc Ponty or El Shanker or Stuff Smith. It can't sound like that. If you've got those four people in a string ensemble all sounding with their individual sound, he can't write for that, or she can't write for that, or they can't write for that, right? Whoever it is that's doing the writing. Often in the classical musician it was men, so sorry for that. But yeah, in classical music it needs to be predictable, right? So predictable in an orchestra that you actually, if you're playing a note, you've got to bow it the same way as every other violinist. Okay? So that's a technology that develops in classical music. That's where part of the training comes from. That's where part of the lessons come from. If you're having classical music lessons, you'll have a lot of lessons based upon the tone of your instrument, and that tone has to be somewhat predictable. It's less so for a soloist, but the soloist has still got to play the score. You know, no soloist can go off and decide to play some blues in the middle of it, right? They have to be predictable. Jazz doesn't do this. What jazz does is it creates an individual sound, right? And that sound, it shows you how you can integrate that into composition. This is really, really important. Jazz music creates compositions. It creates pieces of music. That technology had to learn and show the world how to accommodate these two things, an individual voice and improvisation, right? And there's a third thing I want to throw in the mix, and it's the principle of, let's call it swing or groove. This is an idea of keeping time in a way which is funky, which makes the body move in a certain way. All right. In classical music, you can have dance music, you can have music that's very in time, very out of time. It's all about rhythm and time, you know. And jazz is all about rhythm and time. But when you play that time, when you play the bass, when you play the piano, when you sing, you have to embody it with swing. Right? Swing's a feeling that's embodied in the rhythmical structure of the music. It almost goes beyond the rhythmical structure into the whole structure of the music. So if a musician's going, those notes have to swing, and that swing has to be embodied. This then goes into popular music in all sorts of ways. It goes into the idea of funk, or it goes into the idea of groove, it goes into the idea of soul. Soul is a really interesting name for a certain type of music, I think, because it's saying that the music itself embodies something within it which is beyond the music, that the music sort of has a soul. And I think the idea of swing is a really interesting idea when you put it in that you can look at a musician and go, well, they're playing all the notes right and they're doing everything right, and but it just doesn't swing, does it? And what's that mean? Are they in time? Oh, they're in time. They're hitting all the notes in the right place, but it's not quite in the right place. So these three ideas, I think, are really, really important when we look at what jazz pioneers as an art form. Now let's have a look at the blues, because the blues emerges exactly the same time, and it emerges from America through Afro-American experience. What does blues pioneer? Well, blues pioneers a way of writing songs. It's much more about songs. It's much more about the subject matter, and it seems to. And I don't want to talk too much about this because I really want to talk about jazz, but we're going to have to put it in there. What the blues does is seem to marry the sacred and the profane together, right? It seems to invert the virtue that you would expect to be embodied within music. So blues musicians can talk about quite profane, earthly things, but they can transform those things to discuss, again, the soul, the human spirit, And I think that's something that's really important to blues. Blues also revolutionizes the actual songwriting process, because before then, songs are like diatonic chord progressions, you're arpeggiating through those chord progressions, creating nice little melodies, verse, chorus, and all that type of structure that you associate, which has come from, classical sort of vocal music, and it's come from folk music, but the blues, you get these very strange structures, we know it as a 12-bar blues, but in the early days you got 13 and 11-bar blues, you got all sorts of strange timing, but what's much more important is in the blues, they use a minor pentatonic scale, which has really come from African music. The pentatonic scale is in most folk forms, but it's a minor scale, and they place that over a major chord, and it creates a dissonance, a very strange dissonance, which is a minor third over a major third, and that dissonance becomes the blue note. And then they add other notes like the flat five, and it's these idea of these blue notes, right? This is a different type of harmonic tension that's created within the blues, and of course, that idea is in jazz. Anybody who's tried to learn jazz is desperate to try and find out how you get those weird out notes that are both in and out. It's this idea of groove again, so I feel these are the things which these two styles of music have. Now the problem is because, as I said, many of these are so rooted in recording, we haven't got an idea about what jazz is until we can hear it on a recording. With a piece by Mozart or Beethoven, we can look at the score and infer what was going on, but we haven't got a clue about what was going on in jazz or blues until those first recordings were made. So the first jazz recording is in 1917. It's the original Dixieland Jazz Band. That's the first one we've got. It's even more problematic that it's a white group. So it's a white group that has spotted this amazing music that's being made by New Orleans black musicians, and they've copied it. And of course, there's a whole thing that I do want to talk about on these videos around that. The first blues recording is around about 1920. There's a number of artists we can point to there, but before then, we can. And also, before then, there's no written down history. No one's been plotting this music. No one cared about this music. This is one of the things that's really interesting. And this is the mystery. In the subsequent videos, I want to get deeper into that mystery. But in this first one, I just wanted to throw it out there that because we don't have recordings of jazz till 1917. We really don't know anything about what it sounded like beforehand, and that's intrinsic, you know. So recording is invented around about 1860, 1870, you know. So we're looking at 40 or 50 years until people got round to the idea that they could record other stuff than classical music and maybe a bit of folk music and maybe, you know, bits of Shakespeare. It took a long time to get around to do that. Of course, when they did it and they put those records out, they sold millions. This is something that is never mentioned. The reason why jazz is here is because it was commercially successful. Right? Now, in the next video, I'm going to get deeper into the actual origins of jazz and what I think happened and what we can guess that happened. But the point is that when they recorded that original Dixieland jazz group and they recorded the blues artists in the early 1920s, they sold millions of records and created a thing called the recording music industry. Right, the recording music industry is a much more accurate name for what gets called pop music. Let's call it recorded music, the music industry, right? This is so important, right? So, could it be the case that the styles of music that were recorded in the late 1910s, early 1920s, right? The forms that sold defined what jazz was. I'm pretty sure that most musicians before then didn't really call themselves jazz musicians. So the guy that gets named as the first jazz musician is a guy called Buddy Bolden, who recorded around about 1900. But, you know, by 1905, he was pretty much insane and in an asylum, right? We have no idea what he sounded like, what the music was or anything. That my question is, was that guy, if you had asked that guy what he was playing, would he have said, I'm playing jazz? Or was he playing all sorts of different music which encompassed ragtime, the blues, it encompassed folk music, marching music, bits of classical music? Was he just playing everything? And actually there was a much wider melting pot of musical styles, you know, that we just don't know about, right? Because what happens is as soon as it was recorded, the bits of it that had those elements in embryo of improvisation, individual voice and a groove, which I'm sure was lots of disparate styles of music, that suddenly became commercially viable. And of course, what the industry did was to go, find some more of that. Now, how much did that affect the musicians around that were playing all sorts of things and then looked around and went, hang on, that's what's selling. So I'm going to go and do some more of that. You know, and in doing that, it creates a style of music. My argument in this video is I think jazz, really, you've got to define it as starting with the development of recorded music. And I think once it was recorded and other musicians could hear musicians from other places, what happened is what was actually quite see, jazz is extremely advanced, but it gets extremely advanced very quickly, which I'm going to talk about this in the next video of how this happens. But I think it's partly the recording process and the identification of these things as being cool. When musicians would start to focus on that and then be able to hear recordings, people were able to go, right, that person's doing that, that's been a success. So in other words, the sort of virtuosity and complexity and that exists in jazz actually was created because there was a commercial want for that type of expression. Something I'm just going to touch on before I finish this video is, of course, the story around jazz has never been that. It's always been that this is a sort of, you know, jungle music. It's made by people that aren't educated. It's a non-sophisticated form which is all based upon feel. That's not the case with jazz. Anyone who's studied jazz knows that's not the case. So, in this first video, I've just outlined the mysteries that exist when we start to look at jazz and jazz history. What I'm going to be doing on this channel now is really going deeper into the history of jazz and trying to march my way through it. But I hope you enjoy this video, and if you want to know how jazz actually comes about, you know, from my subjective opinion, please check out the next video. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.